Hello friends, in this session we will discuss the types of a letter of credit. So see friends, there are different types of the letter of credit. So before going to a direct type, we have already discussed some basics of the letter of credit. So before starting with the actual type, we will take a brief revision about the how the letter of credit functions. So friends, we know letter of credit is nothing but the letter from the bank, and it guarantees that the buyer's payment to seller will be received on time, right? That is basic the letter of credit. So friends, how it functions, how it operation, how it is a function. See friends, there is one say it is see here, I will explain in a brief. Here is a suppose one importer is here and one exporter is here, right? We can say importer, it is also called as the buyer, or exporter is also called as the seller. Okay, importer wants to import some goods. So what importer will do? Importer will apply for letter of credit to the bank. It is bank is called as the issuing bank. Why it is called as issuing bank? See, this is suppose in India and this is in the USA. So buyer will approach to suppose a Bank of India, and he will apply for the letter of credit. Then this bank is a issuing bank will issue a letter of credit and send letter of credit to the exporters bank. Suppose this is a Bank of America in the USA. So LC will be sent, and then this is Bank of America in the USA is called as the advising bank. This is called advising bank. That is seller's bank is the advising bank. This bank advise exporter will advise to the exporter that we have received LC and you may ship the goods. So exporter will ship goods to the importer. Okay, and in that return here is some mechanism, some port or some courier mechanism. He will get documents of the shipment. The documents he will give to the advising bank. Advising bank will give that document to the issuing bank, and issuing bank will give that document to the importer. So importer will show that document here at the receiving end, at the receiving port, and will get the delivery of the goods. So in this fashion it happens the function of the letter of credit. How the letter of credit functions, I have given the brief overview. Now we have to discuss the different types of the LC. So friends, see here, very first is the revocable LC. See here, through graphical representation, mainly there are revocable LC, transferable LC, red clause LC, slight LC, it is a site LC, and back-to-back LC, and irrevocable LC. There are some major types of the letter of credit. So friends, we will discuss one by one. Very first, what is the revocable LC? What is a revocable LC? So see friends, this type of LC, through name you can judge, right? That means you cannot revoke that LC. Okay, so revocable LC, this type of an LC can be cancelled or modified by issuing bank without the consent of the parties involved, mainly the beneficiary. Revocable, that means the LC which can be revoked at any time. Okay, so friends, see here, this type of LC can be cancelled or modified, that means can be revoked by issuing bank. Who can revoke? Issuing bank, because issuing bank is issuing the LC, that's why issuing bank can modify. Which LC? Revocable LC. That means the LC which are cancelable or modify, which can be modified, are nothing but the revocable LC. Okay, and here no consent is required from the beneficiary parties. That means suppose this bank has issued some LC, and after the issuing bank want that I want to cancel that LC, so bank can modify or cancel that LC without informing the beneficiary. That is, the seller is the beneficiary of the money, so without informing to the seller, bank can modify that LC. So that's why it is a revocable LC. Okay, and as this is contain the more risk, because if a bank gives the issues the LC and seller will shifts the good, so there will be a loss, right? So that's why these LCs are very rarely used or generally not accepted. Okay, see friends, and there is a possibility that issuing bank will issue the LC and advising bank will advise seller to ship the goods, and after the shipment there is chances that issuing bank may tell that you have to cancel the LC. So in that case the liability lies with the issuing bank only. Suppose this is the issuing bank, right, and this is advising bank, and here is this our seller. Issuing bank issues the LC, right, and seller will receive the LC. Seller have also done the shipment. Suppose the shipment is done around at the 11 a.m. and again that issuing bank says that I have cancelled the LC. So cancellation order came at 12 o'clock. So once the shipment has been already done, the risk, that is the loss, will lies with the issuing bank only. Okay, so there should be a proper communication between the issuing bank and the advising bank and the seller, so that if any loss, the liability lies with the issuing bank. Okay, in case of revocable LC. Nice. Next thing we have to study is the irrevocable LC. So friends, irrevocable LC is very simple. It is just opposite of the revocable LC. That means we have already discussed the revocable LC is the LC which can be cancelled or modified, and vice versa irrevocable LC is nothing but the LC which cannot be cancelled or cannot be modified without the consent of the all the parties. That means in simple word, you cannot modify or change the LC, and that LC is called as the irrevocable LC. Okay, so friends, see here, in case of irrevocable LC, there is a correction or the modification is not allowed. That's why we can say this LC gives guarantee to the seller that he will get a payment on a time and the correct payment. Okay, because it is not a modificable. Modification is not allowed, changes are not allowed, and cancellation is also not allowed. Okay, and all LC usually are irrevocable, as this is more secure. So generally this type of LC is used very high frequently. See friends, if there is not stated in LC, that means a type of LC is not stated, then it should be treated as the irrevocable LC. That means if nothing is written on the LC, whether it is revocable or irrevocable, we have to consider that it is a irrevocable LC. Okay, now we will move to the next type. This is very simple. First two type we have already discussed all the about basics. Now see, next we have to study the revolving LC. So friends, name itself, it is a self-explanatory. Revolving means a LC which revolves. That means on a continuous basis or repeated times that LC go for the negotiation. That means when there is a partial negotiation is involved. See, through example you can easily understand. Suppose a buyer requests a delivery in installment at a specific time, then payment made using the revolving LC. That means suppose this is the buyer and this is the seller, right, and buyer ordered from the seller, suppose we can say 1000 cars, but buyer says that I want monthly only 100 cars. So for a 10 month that a transaction will happen continuously. That means the LC will go for the negotiation at a for the 10 months. That means continuous 10 months LC will go for the negotiation, right. That means if buyer requests delivery in the installments at a specific time, then payment made using the revolving LC. In this case the buyer is demanding the total order of 1000 car, but buyer says I want monthly only 100 cars and it should be continued for the 10 months. In such a cases you have to use the revolving LC. It is visible to you. See, I will repeat again. In case of revolving LC, the buyer is there, seller is there, right. Buyer ordered 1000 cars, but buyer says I want 100 cars per month only, so that for 10 months the transaction will continue, right? So what we say, the buyer requests delivery in the installment at a specific time, then the payment made using the revolving LC. Okay, so we come to know what is the revolving LC. It is basically a partial negotiation. That means instead of 1000 cars, we are getting delivery of 100 cars per month, so we will negotiate the payment for only 100 cars. Okay, that is a partial negotiation. Now next important type we have to discuss is the transferable LC. So what is a transferable LC? See friends, a transferable LC permits the beneficiary, who is the beneficiary? Seller, because seller is getting money from the buyer. Okay, so transferable LC permits the beneficiary to make some or all the credits available to another party. That means by creating the secondary beneficiary. See friends, it is very easy. The party that initially accept the transferable LC from bank is called as the first beneficiary, and also LC once transferred cannot be further transferred to new party. That means, see here, suppose A is there, and here is a B is a suppose A is a buyer, right, and B is a seller. A gives LC to B, right? Suppose A has drawn LC on a B, right? But the buyer what can do? Buyer will transfer that LC to C, right? That means the transfer of LC is allowed only once, right? That means if here you take example of issuing bank draw LC on, suppose C buyer B, buyer can transfer LC only once he can transfer that LC to any party. That means if bank has issued $1000 of LC, then buyer can transfer that LC to any party. That means the LC which is transferable is called as the transferable LC. The name itself, it is a self-explanatory, but remember the first party is called as the first beneficiary and the second party is called as the second beneficiary, or the secondary beneficiary. Remember, so beyond second or secondary beneficiary there is no beneficiary, because LC once transferred cannot be further transferred to new party. That means you cannot create a chain. Only once the beneficiary can be transferred. Okay, beneficiary can transfer the LC only once. So this is all about the transferable LC. Now what is a red clause LC? So friends, see here, red clause LC. This is an LC that gives beneficiary the added security of getting pre-shipment finance. Very easy. So friends, see here, what is LC actually? LC we have discussed, but a red clause, that means the LC which bears clause in a red. That means in a red letters it is written that the clause in a red letters that instructs the bank to advance fund. That means in case of red clause LC, the seller will get advance fund, right, before the shipments of the good. Okay, see, suppose suppose there is a one seller and one buyer and one seller is there, and we have ordered suppose 1000 cars, right? But what the seller will say, that I want some money that to manufacture the 1000 car, I don't have sufficient funds, so you please give me advance against the LC, right? So that I can purchase the raw material. Okay, so in such a cases, when the seller wants some advance money, right, so before the shipments or before the delivery of the goods, the red clause LC is to be used. Okay, that means why it is called as red clause, because on a LC, in the red letter it is written that the bank to advise the bank, it is instructed to the bank that advance fund to the beneficiary before the shipments of the good. That means before the delivery of the goods, you can pay for purchasing raw material or the processing to the seller. Okay, this is all basics about the red clause LC. And see friends, the opening bank gives guarantee of the payment of these funds in case of any default in the beneficiary. who is issuing the LC? The issuing bank is issuing the LC. So definitely, and by issuing bank it is written that in the red letter it is written give advance some funds to the seller for the manufacturing or the purchase of raw material. That's why the whole liability lies with the issuing bank in case of default of by the seller. So definitely the risk lies with the applicant as well as the issuing bank only. Okay, so see here I will explain you. So see this, here is the here is the buyer, and in other country there is a seller. He will approach to the issuing bank. Issuing bank will issue the red clause LC, red clause LC. In that clause the issuing bank say to the advising bank that kindly pay in advance, kindly pay in advance, so that seller can manufacture the goods. So before the delivery, before delivery he gets some advance money. That is nothing but the red clause LC. Okay, now see here, second type we have to discuss is the green clause LC. So friends, it is very easy. In addition to red clause there is a green clause. In that green clause it is just a provision for the warehouse storage of the goods. That means if there are goods to be sold by the seller and which needs the storage facility, then that should be provided. That is written in the green clause LC. Okay, see, it is an extension of the red clause LC, which means it provide advance not only for the purchase of purchase of the raw material, processing, packaging of the goods, but also for the pre-shipment warehousing storage facility. That means in case of green clause you have to provide the advance for the purchase of raw material like a red clause LC. Along with that you have to provide the warehouse storage facility. If this facility is involved, then they need extra funds, right? Seller will need extra funds. So this is written in the green clause LC. So just remember two things you have to remember. In case of a red clause LC, the pre-shipment, that means before the delivery of the goods, the advising bank need to pay to the seller. And in case of greenhouse LC, just remember the keyword, there should be a warehouse storage facility. Okay, for that the extra finance is needed. So remember, in case of green clause the warehouse storage is the keyword. Okay, now we will move to the next LC type. See friends, next LC we have to discuss is the site LC. So it is very easy to remember. Site means on observation, that is on first sight or when you see first time, right? That is a site LC. It is very easy. This type of LC, and LC is payable once it is presented along with the necessary documents. That means when you present the documents you will get the money. See, we have already discussed seller, buyer. Okay, here is the our issuing bank and will give LC to the advising bank, and that buyer will send some goods to the seller, and after sending the goods he will get some documents of shipping. When he present that document to the advising bank, immediately advising bank will pay money to the here is the buyer, here is the seller, right? So when the seller delivers the good, on immediate basis the advising bank will pay to the seller. Okay, that is nothing but the site, that means on first sight, immediate basis. Okay, that is called as the site LC, or we can say site letter of credit. That is site LC. Buyer has to make the payment for the goods immediately, and similarly if seller ships the good, he will receive the documents and send that document to advising bank, and advising bank will send the document to the issuing bank, and issuing bank will give that document for the collection of goods from to the buyer only if buyer pays some money to the issuing bank. Okay, see here I will explain again what is a site LC. See friends, here is suppose here is a buyer and here is a seller. Okay, here is our issuing bank and here is our advising bank. When buyer will order LC, we go here by this route. Okay, and then seller will dispatch the good or delivery of the goods is happen. After delivery, seller will get some documents. Okay, when the documents will given to the advising bank give that document to the issuing bank, and issuing bank give that document to the buyer, and when buyer will represent the document at the port, you will get the delivery. But when the issuing bank will deliver the document to the buyer only if the buyer pays money to the that issuing bank. Okay, that is nothing but the site LC. That means the buyer has to if a buyer want to receive the documents, he need to pay the money to the issuing bank. In case of seller want money, seller need to present the document to the issuing bank, so that safety of delivery is involved. That means assurance about the delivery. That is basically the site of LC, that is site LC. So beneficiary gets payment on representing the documents, or we can say documents are delivered to the applicant. See here documents are only delivered to the buyer, that is applicant, for the collection of delivery only if the payment has been made. That's why this site LC is also called as the DPLC. DPLC stands for your document against the payment. That means you pay the money to the issuing bank, then issuing bank will give you a document for the collection of the goods, right? If you pay the money to the issuing bank, then only issuing bank give you a document for the for delivery, that is for collection of the goods. Okay, this is all about the site LC. And next LC we have to discuss is the acceptance LC. So friends, see here, acceptance LC is just opposite of that is site LC. Acceptance LC, it is also called as the usance LC. So friends, see, while in a usance letter of credit there is an option of deferred payment for the buyer. That means he see here, I will explain again here so that your concept should be clear. Here is a buyer, here is a seller, here is your issuing bank for the buyer, here is advising bank for the seller. When the seller will deliver the goods, he will receive some documents. The document will be sent to the advising bank, and advising bank send the document to the issuing bank, and issuing bank will give that document to the buyer so that buyer can collect the goods on representing that documents. Okay, that means here in case of acceptance or the usance LC, the buyer will accept this document and will say to the bank, I will pay you later. That means usance letter of credit, there is option of a deferred payment for the buyer. You can pay later, you just take a delivery and you can pay later to the issuing bank. Okay, this facility is available in the usance LC, also called as the acceptance LC. Why it is called acceptance LC? Just accepting the documents, buyer is able to take the delivery, but the payment to the issuing bank is not made. So issuing bank is under risk in case of acceptance or usance LC. So that's why the document delivered to the applicant on acceptance only, so that and a payment will be made later. As the payment late is made later, there is a risk involved. Okay, and that LC is called as the DALC, that is a document acceptance, that is document against the acceptance LC, DALC. And a slide LC is called as the DPLC, that is document against the payment. Okay friends, next LC we have to discuss is the deferred payment LC. So what is deferred payment? It is very simple. It is similar to the acceptance LC. We have here discussed how the payment has been deferred. That LC is the document has been collected by the buyer for the collection of the goods from the port. But here in case of similarly in case of deferred payment LC, it is very similar with the acceptance or the usance LC. So just remember that all the things are same. Now we have to discuss important is the back-to-back LC. So what do you mean by back-to-back LC? So basically, see friends, I will explain here basic about idea about back-to-back. Suppose we have issued a LC of $2,000, but here is our seller who want to manufacture the goods, but seller will say to that advising bank that before the delivery of the goods, I need some extra money, I need some advance money, so that I have to purchase some raw material, I have to purchase something from the subcontractor. I have to purchase some raw material from the subcontractor. For that purpose, seller will ask his advising bank. So what advising bank will do? The advising bank will issue another LC of, suppose, say $200, so that he can purchase the goods, and this LC should be in that LC of $200, beneficiary should be the subcontractor. That means back to back LC means, just remember, two LCs are involved in back to back, right? The name itself, it is a self explanatory. In case of back to back, there are two LCs are involved. See here, this type of LC refer to the two LC used together to help the seller finance and purchase the equipment or the services from the subcontractor. So with original LC is called as the master LC, and that we have discussed here, the original LC is of $2,000, and this LC is called as the master LC, right? And secondary LC is called as the another the second LC which is issued is called as the secondary LC. So friends, this is main LC is called as the master LC, and this master LC is kept with the advising bank as a security for issuing the new LC. Okay, so this is the basic funda. So original LC called as the master LC, it should be kept as a security. The seller goes to his own bank. That means seller goes to his own bank, his advising bank, and ask a second LC to be issued with the subcontractor as a beneficiary. See here is we have issued the $200 new LC, and beneficiary is a subcontractor. That means other than the first beneficiary, that you have to remember. Okay, so that is basic about the back to back LC. It is very simple. Just remember the keyword. There are two back to back LCs. One is when one seller is the beneficiary, and in the second the subcontractor is the beneficiary. And who issues back to back LC? The second LC issued by the advising bank. Remember, one liner MCQ. Who issues the second LC? The first LC issued by the issuing bank, and second LC is issued by the advising bank. This is the tricky question. Okay, now next we have to study is the with or without recourse LC. So friends, it is very simple. With recourse, that means here in this case of LC, the risk lies with the issuing bank, and in case of without recourse, the risk of a non-payment, that is a risk of default by the seller, lies with the applicant, lies on the nominating bank. That means in case of with recourse LC, the risk lies with the issuing bank. That means issuing bank has to pay if the applicant or the buyer don't pay. But in case of without recourse, the risk of a non-payment by the applicant lies on the nominating bank. So that's why it is very simple. Remember, here is your buyer, here is our seller. Buyer is also called as the applicant. Here is our issuing bank, and here is our advising bank. In case of buyer gets default, in case of with resource, the risk lies with the issuing bank, and in case of without, the risk lies on the advising or the nominating bank. So it is very simple. You can remember easily. With that means issuing bank, and without that means the opposite party, that is nominating bank. Next is the confirmed LC. What is confirmed LC? It is very simple. The other bank gives guarantee that opening bank will pay. That means we have discussed here. See here again, that here is a third bank is involved, say confirming bank, and confirming bank take a guarantee that this bank, that is issuing bank, will definitely pay to the advising bank or the seller, so that the confirming bank takes the guarantee. So that type of LC is called as basically the confirmed LC. That means here is 100% security. Okay, next is the standby LC. So standby LC is a very simple. It is just like a bank guarantee, but as in case of standby in case of standby LC, it is like a bank guarantee, and it follows the protocol called as the ISP 98, that is international set of practices it is a ISP 98 and is also approved by the RBI. So this protocol followed by the standby LC. So friends, remember that ISP 98 is followed by the it is approved by the RBI. So that you have to remember. So as it is approved by the RBI, it is also used in India. And one important thing, friends, it is the most risky because it is like a bank guarantee, and we know in a bank guarantee there is no proof for the delivery of the shipments. Okay, so that's why it is more risky. So in this way we have discussed different types of the letter of credit. So before going to next part, we have to discuss, you have to remember all the types because they can frame a one-liner MCQ based on that. So in standby LC, just remember it is a ISP 98. It is approved by Reserve Bank of India, so that our Indian exporter importer will use that code. Okay, it is international standard practices ISP 98, and it is used in the standby LC. It is like a bank guarantee. In bank guarantee there is no proof for the shipments. That's why it is the most risky, because there is no evidence for the shipment. So in this way we have discussed different types of the LC. So see here our first sheet what we have discussed. See here we have discussed irrevocable LC, that means which cannot be altered. We have discussed revocable LC, that means which can be changed or cancelled by the issuing bank, right? Next we have discussed transferable LC, that means which can transfer to another party from one beneficiary to second beneficiary, but beyond that you cannot transfer. Next we have discussed red clause LC. In that by red pen it is written that the advising bank can pay in advance before the delivery of the goods. Next we have discussed the sight LC. On representing the LC or the document, we have to pay immediately. That is called as the sight LC. That means on observation, on first sight. Okay, and in case of in case of buyer, on a buyer need to pay money first and then bank will pay the documents. In case of seller, bank has to give the money, then seller will give the documents. That means on representing the documents, this LC is payable. Just remember, on presenting the document, this LC is payable. Next, the back-to-back LC we have discussed. That means here two LCs are here, and one main LC is called as the master LC, and second LC is issued by the advising bank, and the main LC is issued by the issuing bank. So in this fashion we have discussed the main important types of the letter of credit. We will continue our discussion in the next part.